Okay, welcome everyone. At the end of 2013, so not too long ago, scientists and students from five groups, three from the UK, one from the Netherlands and one from France, came together in Hull to use the facilities there to look into wave ripples in mixtures of cohesive clay and cohesionless sand. And I'm here to present to you the first results of those experiments. And I call these results preliminary because it's still early days. We haven't analyzed all the data yet. So there won't be an awful lot of numbers in this presentation, but I hope you will like the first results because I think they are pretty interesting. So after the rationale, I'm going to go back in time a little bit and to describe the type of research we've done on bedform development in mixed cohesive clay and sand under currents. Then we go on to the new experiments, the same type of research but on the waves, and I'll describe first the methodologies and then the results, and I hope to present to you some wider implications of our data as well. Now we all realize that clays and muds are important in the natural environment, right? They provide fertile soils, they make floods, river floods and coastal floods particularly messy. They're important for ecosystem health, and their negative aspects include siltation of harbors, mud flows and contamination. And from an applied perspective, clays and muds provide construction material, and they're now important in the geological past as well when we talk about shale gas. But strangely enough, there are a relatively small number of investigations on the effects of the transport, the dynamics of mud in the natural environment. Most of our knowledge that we use for sediment transport modeling, for example, is based on sand only. And we need to include the sticky component in there as well, because if you realize that 75% of all the sediments on the surface of the Earth contains fine-grained material, which is potentially cohesive, you understand why this is important. So there's a lot of different properties if we compare sand versus clays and mud, but most of these properties boil down to one specific aspect, and that is cohesion. Clays are cohesive, sticky, sand is cohesionless, and that makes the behavior of clays in the natural environment rather different from pure sand. Now I've been lucky to be involved in a number of research projects in the past that looked at the development of current-generated bedforms in mixtures of sand and clay. And the results were quite interesting. On the left-hand side, we see here a short summary of work we've done on the development of small-scale current ripples in these mixtures. And the main results we found was that if you look at the final bedform height, the final ripple height, you see that it decreases with increasing mud fraction in the bed until it falls off a cliff and the heights of the bedforms become particularly small. Also, the surface pattern of these bedforms changes from three-dimensional, tongue-shaped, short crests at low clay concentrations to more two-dimensional with long crests at high clay concentrations. Now we since then extended our research to larger scale bedforms under currents as well in dunes, and the results were pretty interesting because what we saw at relatively low clay concentrations at certain flow conditions, at this case 80 centimeters per second flow, nicely developed dunes with smooth surfaces. But then, if we then increase the clay content to 12% and keep all the other boundary conditions the same, we see that the dunes fully disappear and you end up with a bed which is fully composed of current ripples. And that has major implications for the roughness of those surfaces and therefore major implications for sediment transport modeling. Now, we have a pretty good idea now how mixtures of sand and mud behave in under currents, but we haven't done similar research on the waves yet, and that is what this HydroLab project was about. So we used the total environment simulator in Hull, had a range of different instrumentations, and I can only show you the first results, the first data sets we analyzed. We had ADVs to measure flow velocities, ABS and ODS to measure suspended sediment concentrations, ISCO samplers to take suction samples out of the water. We use an acoustic bed scanner to quantify the development of the bed forms, and we use wave gauges to get the wave parameters. What I'm going to show you today is data from the acoustic bed scanner, from the ISCO, and we also took sediment cores both before the start of each run and after the end of each run for grain size analysis. Essentially, what we were interested in was how much clay was in the bed to start with and how much clay was left at the end. We used regular water surface waves with a wave height of almost 20 centimeters, wave period of 2.5 seconds, and a wavelength of almost 6 meters. Maximum wave orbital velocities were 0.34 meter per second. Standing water depth was 60 centimeters. We used quite a coarse sand, medium to coarse sand, almost 500 micron D50, and the clay type we used was kaolin clay. We used these different clay fractions ranging from 0% pure sand, that was our control run, to 5.5%. The initial bed state was a plain bed, and the duration of the runs were between 290 and 517 minutes. This slide shows the results of our control run. So we're talking about pure sand here. On the left-hand side of this graph, you see different stages of wave ripple development derived from our bed scanner. And you can see that the ripples develop rather quickly. After 20 minutes, this line here, you see that a small part of the bed is still developing. After 3 minutes, the whole bed had reached equilibrium. In fact, the equilibrium time was about 35 minutes. At that time, the ripples reached a height of 18 millimeters and a length of 122 millimeters. The right-hand side shows the development curve of height in red and, length in red and height in blue. You can see very rapid development to start with, and then the line flattens out when you reach equilibrium. This photograph shows how the ripples look like in the flume. The wave ripples in a mixed sediment behave differently. The ripple growth rate, so the slope of the development curve, decreased progressively as the bed clay content was increased. At 4.5%, 4.6% clay, it's not too different from the control case. The ripple development was slightly slowed down. But at 5.3%, there was a clear delay in the development of the wave ripples on the bed. And that is particularly well shown in these development curves here. This is 5.3% clay again, and you see that you need quite a long period to reach equilibrium conditions if you compare that to smaller clay percentages. Same for 5.5%. So the development curves also show that the growth rate decreases with increasing clay content. But what you also see is that the first appearance of the wave ripples is delayed at the highest bed clay content. But what seems to be coming out of these graphs is that the equilibrium height of the ripples and also the equilibrium wavelength of the ripples is not affected. And that is shown in this diagram a little bit better, where we plot initial bed clay fraction against ripple height, now in red, and ripple length in green. You see that most of the ripples, the equilibrium ripples, have more or less the same height and the same length, independent of clay content. But that's not the case for the blue line, which shows equilibrium time. So up to about 5%, there's a slight increase perhaps in the time needed to reach equilibrium, but then it skyrockets. You see that at above 5%, you need exponentially long time to reach equilibrium conditions. We also did take sediment cores, both before each run, on the top graph here, and of the final bed, and we took two types of core, one penetrating through the ripple crest, and another other cores penetrating through the ripple trough. This graph shows the initial bed clay content as a function of the final bed clay content. So along this stippled line here, indicated by 0%, nothing happens. So you have exactly the same amount of clay at the start and at the end. If you're below this line, clay disappears. If you're above this line, clay is somehow gained. If you look at the red line first, which shows the clay content within the wave ripples, you see that all the clay has been removed very efficiently from the original bed. So there's no clay left at the end of the experiment for each of the different starting clay contents. This is a winnowing process. Clay is taken up into the water column, and this winnowing process is very efficient, apparently. The blue line shows the clay contents below the wave ripples at the end of each run. You see that initially the blue line follows nicely the 0% line, but then it starts to go above this blue line. So for some reason, you add clay to the bed at these relatively high starting clay conditions. So how can we explain all this? Well, these are our additional initial thoughts, so I would very much like to have your opinion about this as well. But we know that winnowing takes place from previous work we've done with current ripples. So it's relatively safe to assume that winnowing takes place above wave ripples as well, although we have seen that it's much more efficient. We have some indirect evidence for that. If we compare the suspended sediment concentrations of run 1, which is our control run, with run 6, which is one of our mixed sediment run, we see that in the mixed sediment run, the suspended sediment concentrations are higher, up to an order of magnitude, than for our control run. Now, this clay has to come from somewhere, and the most likely is, of course, the bed. Okay, so clay is selectively taken into suspension during ripple development, but what we also think happens is that the waves act as a pump. And this pump, some of the clay may be pumped out of the bed into suspension, but part of the clay may also be pushed into the bed. And that might be the reason for the fact that we have this increase in clay content compared to the starting conditions. What might have helped is that we use a relatively coarse sand. We use 500 micron sand with a high porosity. So that might have helped this pumping mechanism. So what are the implications? Well, bedform size predictions are essential for numerical simulations of sediment transport in the coastal zone. And we found in our experiments that the equilibrium ripple size is independent of the clay content in the mixed sediment bed. This is great, because this implies that the existing bedform predictors seem to work also for mixed cohesive sediment. But there's a but there, and that is that you need to take care of the increased equilibrium time. So the ripple development is delayed, as we found in our experiments, and in fact you only need a relatively small amount of clay to produce a large delay in ripple growth. That means that perhaps non-equilibrium wave ripples may be more common than assumed in the coastal zone. So you need to account for this hysteresis effect. It's difficult to recognize these delays caused by bad cohesion because of this high efficiency of the winnowing. In fact, the ripples that we produced in the lab didn't have clay at all, so you couldn't tell perhaps that these ripples were formed from mixed sediments. But there's an indirect way where you can do that, and that is by looking for the presence of mixed clay and sand underneath the wave ripples. That might be an indication of winnowing in some cases. You can perhaps take it one step further and then use the clay content underneath the ripples as a proxy for the original clay content. And that may give you the opportunity to estimate the ripple development rate if you know the wave forces. But there's a complication there. That is this downward flux of clay by wave motion, this pumping mechanism which pushes clay into the bed, if that really exists. Because that would cause an overestimation of the equilibrium time for your bedforms. And the final implications, which is separate from the other implications here, is that the winnowing is very, very efficient. And that may affect the water quality. It may affect the water quality in a positive way, by releasing nutrients, which then organisms can use to thrive on, or it can also be a negative effect. You increase the turbidity of the water, and you may also release pollutants which tend to be attached to clay minerals in the natural environment. So to summarize, we found that cohesive forces cause wave ripple development in mixed sand and clay to take longer than in pure sand. However, there's a longer time needed for, the equilibrium height and the length of the ripples is similar. There's very efficient winnowing, so equilibrium wave ripples formed in mixed sand and clay tend to be free of clay, at least within the range of conditions that we looked at. There may be this process of wave pumping, which may push clay deeper into the bed, especially in this relatively cool sand we used, and our experimental results may have potentially important implications for sediment transport modeling and for water quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Paper is now open for questions or comments. All?
Since you, if I understood you correctly, the red is the ripple itself.
Sorry, the what?
The red line was the clay content in the ripple itself, right? So since you winnow out all the clay, eventually you end up with the ripple, the active layer, the ripple itself being, of course, essentially pure sand, and therefore you get the same result.
Exactly.
Now, did you do any, but when you have enough 5.5% clay, then it took a very long time to get to a complete equilibrium. Did you do any measurements of ripple geometry on your way to that equilibrium? Because that would still be with 4.6% clay or something like that, and to see if there is an effect.
We have that data. It's just that we haven't analyzed it yet. Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's key. Yeah.
Joel?
Yes, when you talk about equilibrium ripples, in fact, do they move also along the current, or they stay at rest?
They do slightly, and in fact, ripple movement is a requirement for taking all the clay out of the surface. So the center still contains clay. So you need to move over at least one ripple wavelength to take the last bit of clay out of the bed.
Okay, so in that case, the finite length of your channel is not a limitation to observe this equilibrium state, because the wave moves to the end of the channel. No?
Well, the migration rate is very, very slow, and within the time period that we let the runs go, the wave ripples didn't reach the end.
Any other comment or question? Yes? Down there.
Can you speculate on some level why, when there is no clay there 3D, when there is clay there 2D?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Sorry.
Why ripples are three-dimensional? Three-dimensional without clay and two-dimensional with clay.
That was for the current ripples, right?
Sorry?
That was only for the current ripples, not for the wave ripples. The wave ripples were two-dimensional.
Anyway, why is it like that for current?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. There's one possibility, and that is that in the case of the current ripples, we didn't allow the runs to continue for long enough to change from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional end result. Because we know that current ripple development goes through stages in which two-dimensional forms are an intermediate stage towards the final three-dimensional stage. But we did continue those runs for pretty long, so I'm not so sure whether that would eventually result into 3D bedforms. That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Question from Dan?
Yeah. So this was more a curiosity, I think. So as your equilibrium time is so long, you may infer that your C state changes, and so the characteristic waves are also changing. So at the end, will you ever reach an equilibrium state?
Good question. Probably not. If your C state changes continuously, and it will do, yeah, what is the chance that you actually reach equilibrium conditions? If you have pure sand, you might do, because you only need, well, under our wave forcing, 20-30 minutes. But if you need 200 minutes to reach equilibrium, probably not. No, you wouldn't. You would never get equilibrium states. So the next question then is, how reliable are our bedform predictors?
All right, then I will close the discussion. Thanks, Irene.
Thank you.
Couple of